I am John Miller from the Department of Classics here at UVA, and this year I'm the president of the St. Anselm Institute for Catholic Thought. This session of the Virginia Festival of the Book is co-sponsored with the St. Anselm Institute, along with the St. Nicholas Orthodox Church and UVA Center for Christian Study. I've been asked to impart a few bits of housekeeping to start out. Number one, those of you who have devices, please turn them off, mute them, whatever, for the duration. Secondly, everybody should have received or will have available to you an evaluation form from the Virginia Festival of the Book, which you're asked to fill out and deposit in the back on your way out. So please do that. Thirdly, there is going to be a book sale of some of Robert's books right in the back of the room, there in the back left. And you are welcome to purchase not only the book about which Robert will be speaking today, but a couple of his previous books. And Robert will be available, of course, for signing these at the end of the proceedings today. Fourthly, finally, before presenting our speaker, I'd like to note that if you're interested in getting on the mailing list for the St. Anselm Institute, that after the talk, please just come over to this table in the back and put down your name and your address and we'll put you on. We have a full array of speakers every year. Well, as you know, our speaker is Robert Louis Wilken, who is very well known in this community as Emeritus William R. Kenan Professor of History of Christianity here at UVA. Professor Wilken received his PhD from the University of Chicago, and in addition to his many years here in the Department of Religious Studies, he taught in various capacities at several other institutions. And if I listed the itinerary that he's had, you would see that as just one indication of how much he is in demand, even now in his retirement, as one of the world's most eminent scholars of early Christianity. Professor Wilken's work is astonishingly diverse. I vividly remember in 1984 the excitement that greeted his book, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, a fascinating study of the antipathy to the Christian movement in its first 5 centuries. And since then, Professor Wilken has explored the Christian tradition, especially the early Christian tradition, in many books, articles, essays. His many books include Remembering the Christian Past, his widely acclaimed Introduction to Early Christian Thought, entitled The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, Seeking the Face of God. That's one of those available for purchase. A study of the biblical lands in Christian practice and imagination, The Land Called Holy, Palestine in Christian History and Thought. And Isaiah, interpreted by early Christian and medieval commentators, a volume in an ambitious series edited by Professor Wilken, called The Church's Bible. And this is just a selection. Today, as you know, Professor Wilken is here to talk about his most recent book, The First 1,000 Years, A Global History of Christianity. This is a terrific book that I had the pleasure of reading over the spring break just concluded here. And in this book, Professor Wilken expands his range even further, starting with Jesus and moving through Constantine's conversion, the controversies and growing pains of the Latin West, the Greek East, and the church among many other peoples and places. As in all his work, Professor Wilken in this book displays his rigorous scholarship and a learning that is deep but lightly born, and his great gift as a lively storyteller, as well as his ability to weave together disparate materials into a coherent and compelling whole. It's a great honor for me to present to you Robert Louis Wilken. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, the honor is mine, I can assure you. I never for a moment thought I'd ever be invited to the Virginia Festival of the Books. Generally, I don't like those kind of books that are part of the festival. But, I tend to write books about all things with a lot of footnotes in them. And as many of you know, of course, most scholars, when they read books, they don't really read much else except the footnotes that refer to their own books. Or actually modern intellectual writers. The very good story about William Buckley, the editor of the National Review, and he sent a copy of his book to Norman Podhoretz, who was the editor of Commentary magazine. And of course, when Norman Podhoretz got the book, the first thing he went to was the index to see if his name was there. And right next to his name, Bill Buckley had written, "Hi, Norm." But it's so good to come back to Charlottesville. Carol and I were reminiscing. We actually moved here 28 years ago, in the summer of 1985. Thanks to Nathan Scott, who was chairman of the Department of Religious Studies at the time. Many of you, of course, remember Nathan. How could you not remember Nathan? So when he died, someone said some of the glory has left the world. And I remember he invited us over for dinner, and they were very formal. And it was middle of August, blazing hot. And I called and I said, well, what would be proper attire? And Nathan said, Charlotte prefers that the gentlemen wear jackets. Which, of course, is more a statement about Nathan. Anyway, I'm very honored to be a part of it. And this is a UVA book, really. I mean, it was largely written here, researched in the library here, and much of it came out of my general survey of early Christian history that I taught in the religion department for many, many years. And there are many people, some of whom are here tonight, who really made it possible. People like Judith Kovacs, Harry Gamble, Elizabeth Myers, Ted Lendon, John Dobbins, Augustine Thompson, who's now no longer here, Muhammad Sawai, I studied Arabic with him, David Kovacs, Thomas Noble, who was here back in some years ago, John Yannis, James Campbell in the library, the slide librarians in the art library. So I'm here to thank all the people and this fine institution for making it possible to study the things that I did, which in some ways this is an unusual plant to have grown up in Mr. Jefferson's University, a book on the history of Christianity, but there it is. I wanted to write a book that people would read, not a book to pore over. So early on I made the decision not to include notes. I knew I would get flack from some of the reviewers, and one has actually pointed that out. But the scholarly debates belong in learned journals and monographs, and most of the people who will read this book have little interest in trying to chase out the footnotes, and a lot of the material is actually pretty much in the public domain. It's not, in that sense, a work of original scholarship. It's a work of putting things together. Very last summer, when I was reading the proofs on the book, I began to have some second thoughts and wonder whether we could put in footnotes at the end, but then I stayed with my original decisions. For years I've been asked to recommend a general history of the early church, and in truth there really wasn't one that did what I thought was the kind of job that was needed. Most of them end too soon, maybe around the year 500, and it's just not enough. Many are too learned, some are too cluttered with details, some focus primarily on the West, and I wanted to give a full story to the East, not only to the Greek East, to the Slavic East, but also the East of the East, Armenia. I see my good friend Goroyan here. I have a chapter on Armenia. I hope you're not offended that I had to include Georgia with it and not just Armenia. Chapter on Ethiopia. But I wanted to kind of tell the story in all of its breadth. And as John Miller said, I wanted to tell a story. A big story to be sure, but a story nonetheless. That meant keeping the narrative moving by making the chapters short. When I wrote The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, I limited myself to 25 pages, roughly typescript, per chapter. And this one I put it down to 15 pages. That's about 4,500 words. Which means that the biggest decision you have to make is what to exclude. And so I did that to try to keep the story moving. And I also, because I wanted to tell a story, I tried each chapter to focus on one person or thing. So when I want to talk about martyrdom, I don't just kind of survey martyrdom. I talk about Cyprian, the great bishop in the 3rd century. When I want to talk about the building of catacombs, I focus on one catacomb, the catacomb on Callistus. When I talk about art and architecture, thanks to John Dobbins, who is here, I decided to focus on one church primarily, San Vitale. When I wanted to focus on Christianity as a learned tradition, I focused on Origen of Alexandria. When I wanted to talk about hospitals, which is a very, very significant part of the early history of the church, I focused on Basil, who was the 4th century, who was the person who built the first hospital. It was a way of actually, I noticed my good friend John Jane is here, of honoring the role that physicians played. Because one of the most significant things that happened in this period is that they began to destigmatize illness. Profound and long-ranging development. In fact, a Coptic monk by the name of Shanuta said that if anyone laughing or mocking calls someone blind, lame, dumb, crippled, maimed, or other names, he shall be punished. They use those words not as descriptions, but as good. And I wanted to talk about the Church of the East, that is those Christians way off in present-day Iraq and Iran and beyond. I focus on a man by the name of Timothy. A figure that doesn't really come up in most histories. When I wanted to focus on Spain under the Muslims, I tell the story of the martyrs of Cordoba. It's a fascinating story that very few people know about. When I go to the Slavic, the mission to the Slobs, I focus on the great missionary Cyril of Methodius. And that way I wanted to give people something to remember. And for those of you who have read the book, the first sentence is very important. I say, what power, I'm quoting here the Polish poet, Miłosz. I identify him as a Lithuanian poet because he was born in Lithuania. And my dear friend George Weigel, who maybe you've been watching on the news with the election of the new pope, writes me as soon as he gets the book and he says, he should be a Polish poet. He wrote in Polish. I knew that. And he said, it should be Polish. So I said, here you go. This is the first sentence of the book, and I've already got something wrong. Anyway, what he says is this: what power preserves what once was if memory does not last? The past doesn't vanish at once. It dies slowly. But if remembered, the dead maintain their ground and live among us. So the book is an exercise in memory, trying to remember this grand history of Christianity. I also wanted to tell the story of the Christian mission, which is largely untold because the early history tends to focus on the Roman Empire. And there wasn't an organized mission in the Roman Empire. It's not until Christianity moves outside the empire that you get an organized mission. So I wanted to talk about Armenia, Georgia, Ethiopia, ancient Nubia, which is Sudan, when you move into Black Africa. There are Christian communities in India, in what is today Uzbekistan, all the way to China, all through that area. The fabulous mission, of course, the mission to the Slavic-speaking people. So, and I had not really thought of it this way, but sort of midway through, because of all the interest in global Christianity, I decided to stick that word into the title, which, of course, my editor loved, because that might mean it really has something to do with this big, big, wide world. So it's called The Global History. And I deliberately picked an event in the East as the ending point, the conversion of Vladimir, the great Rus prince, rather than ending simply with Charlemagne in the West. The year 1000 is a kind of arbitrary choice. Vladimir was baptized in 988. And so that way I kind of gave a focus on the spread of Christianity to the east. And I have extensive history of, I think you have a chapter on Justinian, the great Byzantine emperor, on iconoclasm. But once the spread of Christianity outside the empire becomes part of the story, one comes face to face with the great cultural and linguistic diversity of the early church. The center of Christianity is not Rome. Rome is a center, but it is not the center of Christianity. And I got a letter from a dear friend of mine, who's a great liturgical scholar, Robert Taft, and he said, it was so good to have you say that so clearly, that really in the early church you had almost a kind of aggregate of churches with different centers. Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad, and then Arasabia in Ethiopia. It's not, and in fact, it's not even geographically the center. The center is much more Jerusalem, because a large part of the Christian world was east of Jerusalem. And so I discussed what's called the Church of the East, what we used to call Nestorians, but that's kind of a put down because Nestorius was a heretic. And it's very interesting that what they called the Catholicos, or the patriarch of the Church of the East, who was in Baghdad, under the Muslims, the bishops there said of him that he is our Peter. So they used the same text, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. Also, I wanted to make the point that Christianity is not simply a religion. The planting and growth of Christian communities led to the remaking of the cultures of the ancient world and the creation of a new civilization, or more accurately, several new civilizations. Christianity is a culture-forming religion. Hence, art, architecture, music, institutions, hospital, law, holy places, language. And that's to illustrate some of these things, I, of course, had to include pictures. And thanks to my fine editor at Yale, we were able to put in some really nice color images right smack in the center of the book. Christianity's relation to culture is many-sided, and the influence runs in both directions. It not only learns from, but it also changes culture. And I give some examples of this. Well, and I've got a couple of pictures to illustrate this. For example, there is a wonderful icon of Jesus and a Coptic monk named Minos. And the icon, I have a picture of it here, some of you will know it. Jesus has his arm over Minos' shoulder. So he's not a kind of autocratic figure. It's a very human gesture. And it's a very well-known icon. Well, one day I was sitting in the Library of Congress and I was going through a book on Coptic art or Egyptian art, and I found that that particular gesture was used in Egyptian funerary art, where someone's being sent into the underworld. And he's got the god, the dog-faced god, jackal-faced god standing there, and he's got his arm around this man. So here, this Christian artist was painting Christ, but he was painting him in a way that was very much within the Egyptian tradition. And that's one of the mysteries of the way in which Christianity interrelates with culture. Another example I give is Nubia, which is south of Egypt and north of Ethiopia. Some decades ago, a beautiful church was discovered, and it was excavated by Polish archaeologists. And they found the walls covered with frescoes. And there's one fresco where you have St. Peter, and I got that picture in here. St. Peter is standing behind Peter, who's the bishop of this church, of this cathedral. Peter has a cream-colored face, and the Nubian bishop has a coal-black face. So the artist, the Nubian artist, wanted to picture something that was recognizable. And then there are other ones of that sort. So the way it interacts here. So Christianity's relation to culture is many-sided. It doesn't just take over. It changes, and the two kind of work together. There are many other examples that I could give. One, for example, is that the early Christian churches, the way in which the Romans and the Greeks honored their gods was by building temples. The temple was basically a house of the god. and it was where the statue of the god would stand. But whatever liturgical activity took place in front of the building. But it didn't work for Christians. They didn't have any statues of their God, but it didn't work because they needed a space. Because you had a table, an altar, you had a place where you could read, you had to be able to carry the books around. So they took the basilica, which was a completely secular building, and made it into a church. And that became the basic structure that shaped all Christian architecture after that time. I also have a section on music. I have interested in music, care a great deal about music. And one of the things I discovered is that what we call the stave or the staff, the musical form in which you read, where you have lines, and the notes can be on the line or between the lines, and that will signify pitch. Well, that was dreamed up by monks in Western Europe in the 8th and the 9th century. And then it shaped the whole history of music after that way. There's a beautiful story. One of the men by name of something of Arezzo, he goes to Rome because the Pope wants to know what he's been doing, and he shows him what he's done and explains it to him, and the Pope then is able to sing the melody, and he says, my goodness, I can sing it without having heard it. Whereas up to that time, the only way you could pass on melodies is by hearing somebody sing it or play it on an instrument. So, another thing that I try to develop is the public character of Christianity. Conversion was not a warming of the hearts. Conversion was basically a complete transformation of public space. Adoption of Christianity led to the formation of a new public square. There was no naked public square in antiquity. Religion permeated everything. So Christianity made its place into the center of the city and changed the way the whole city lived. It wasn't a matter of individual conversion. In fact, one of the things that is really significant is that Christianity always spreads from the top down. There would have been no spread of Christianity unless you first converted the king or the queen. And from there it came down. So the model that we have of going out and preaching, especially in the United States, of revivals, has nothing to do with the way it was done. Another thing I discovered is a lot of the histories of the early church spend a lot of time talking about theology. And it is important. But this is not a book about theology. And I discovered that institutions are profoundly important. And the three most important institutions were the bishop, the priest, the bishop, the king, and then monasticism. Just a little bit about each one. There was no Christianity without the bishop. When they would go to a place like Armenia, and the king would be converted, or some other country, then he would send back to the Roman Empire to have a bishop come. So there would be a line of continuity. So all through the world, I say this to the evangelicals, there is no enduring Christianity without the bishop in these centuries. It just is not. It's part of what the deal is. And so when people like Gary Wills write books about why priests, he just doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. I mean, it's a very, very stupid book for a guy who's got a decent education. I mean, it's just... we don't know how things got started. You can't kind of point at this period and this date and this date, but we know that very early on. In other words, Christianity comes into the world as a community, not as a group of individuals. And the community has to have structure. It has to have order. And that's very much the case. The second institution is monasticism. Monasticism is everywhere. Once it gets moving, beginning most likely in Egypt, the monks become omnipresent. We have an image of them as kind of solitaries in the desert, but they very quickly adapt to all different forms of life. And it becomes communal. And it becomes extraordinarily adaptable. So that wherever you go, you have monks, and they become part of a flourishing Christian culture. Whether you're in Ireland, or you're in Egypt, or you're in Eastern Europe, or you're in the Syriac Middle East. or even beyond that. And then finally, the king and the emperor, as I've already said, and the ritual pronouncement of anathemas against Constantinianism, like my dear friend Stanley Hopkins. This has become so commonplace that we forget the church would never have made its way without the support of kings. Constantinianism is part of what Christianity was. And in fact, in the Roman Empire, it came late. In most other places, you started with Christianity having an alliance with the king. Now, it posed an enormous challenge, to be sure, and a lot of bad things came out of it. But on the whole, there was no other way in which Christianity proceeds. So what provokes the ire of critics is really an ordering of Christian society that flourished in medieval and early modern Europe, and still becomes, and still in these early centuries, is the basis on which Christianity finds a home. I also made the rise of and spread of Islam integral to the story. And I do owe a lot of that to, because the book I wrote on the Holy Land I wrote when I was here at this university. When I came here, I studied Arabic for 3 years with Muhammad Sawadi in the Arabic department. And that really sort of spread, widened my vision. And so I have 4 chapters on the rise of Islam and then Christianity under Islam. And I wanted to give in these first of these chapters, which is called No God But God, the rise of Islam or something of that sort, I wanted to give a sympathetic account of Islam for the kind of readers I have, which are going to be in the main Christian readers, culturally Christian readers, put it that way. And to show why Islam is such a powerful religious force. I have a whole chapter and try to give a fair account of that. And for many readers, this will be new material, because at least those of a certain age, that's never been part of our education to study Islam. But then I wanted to show the consequences of the spread of Islam for Christians in different parts of the world. So the first area, of course, is the Middle East, which means Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran. And that whole area of Christianity was Syriac-speaking, or Aramaic, if you will, whereas in the Roman Empire it was Greek and Latin. And in these areas, Christianity very quickly learned to speak Arabic. And then, here again, the monks come in. The monks begin to translate the Bible, the stories of the saints, other documents into Arabic. And so what happens, you have an extraordinary development that you develop an Arabic-speaking culture. Arabic is not just a Muslim language. It's one of the oldest Christian languages. In fact, I think there's going to be a lecture at the St. Anselm Institute of Sidney Griffith just on this topic. And he is the world expert on Christianity. And what they do is they not only translate, but they actually write original theological works. And there's one figure that I do discuss, a name that doesn't really come in most histories, Theodore Abukura, who was the first to write theological treatises in Latin. Egypt's a completely different story because Egypt had a strong Coptic tradition with its own language. Coptic is the ancient Egyptian language. And because they had the language and they had a culture that held them together, they were able to withstand for a longer time the influx of the new Arabic culture that was being established. So eventually they did have to adopt Arabic, but the Coptic held them together, so the monks continued to pray in Arabic. And that's the reason, very simple reason, why today the largest community in the Middle East is in Egypt, the largest Christian community. Because they had their own distinctive culture and language. They held on to it. Whereas if you move over to North Africa, present-day Tunisia and Algeria, there the language was Latin, because it had been conquered by the Romans, and it had never really penetrated deep into the indigenous culture. There never was a Bible in the local language. It was always in Latin. And Christianity fairly quickly disappears. So if you go today to Tunisia, and go to Tunis, there will not be an indigenous Christian community from the beginning. Whereas Egypt, there are many. In the Middle East, there are many. In Turkey, there are many. And then it's hard to find jokes when you're writing this thing, but it's a little subtle joke, but I thought it was pretty good, actually. This is a name that doesn't appear in the history books. Benjamin was the Coptic patriarch who presided over the Christian community in the years immediately after the Muslim conquest, that is roughly 650. And we have a sermon of his. It's on the wedding of Cana. And don't know the story of the wedding of Cana, I think. And so patriarch Benjamin has the disciples say to the host, "If you can't provide enough wine for the wedding, why did you invite us?" Got a great laugh line, but I thought it was pretty funny. Spain is also, it's a completely different story in Spain, because Spain develops a brilliant Muslim culture. Many of you have been to Cordoba, you know you have this magnificent mosque, which unfortunately in the 16th century they built a church right in the middle of it. It's one of the great architectural wonders. But Spain posed a real challenge because, especially once Arabic became the native culture, the young men who were trying to get ahead learned Arabic and learned to love Arabic poetry. And so they began then to forget their Latin, which was their cultural language here. And so there's a wonderful quotation. "The young men enthusiastically read and study Arabic books and are ignorant of their own language and have no interest in Christian literature. For anyone who can write a letter in Latin to a friend, there are 1,000 who can express themselves in elegant Arabic," which is a loss of Christian identity, though Latin culture did survive. And then there's the story of the Mourners of Cordoba. And this shows that the Christian community was really beginning to wonder whether it was losing its strength. And so one day a monk came down from a monastery up in the mountains, and he goes into a court where there's a Muslim judge, Qadi, and he blasphemes the Prophet Muhammad to make a powerful witness. Well, of course, he's executed, and they hang him up along the river the next day. Well, then for the next several decades, people continued to do this. So it was a kind of desperate but powerful witness that they were not going to give in. And of course, Christianity survived then in Spain. But the Mourners of Cordoba is a beautiful story. And so that is, I'm getting here toward the end. Where my papers here, it's too busy telling stories. There we go. All right, so 8, 9, here. And then Spain, I'm going to end now with Spain, and I'm going to read a little bit from the afterward. Spain is interesting because they did learn Arabic well. And a man by the name of Robert of Kenan, who was a British scholar, came to Spain because he wanted to read Arabic manuscripts. He was mostly interested in scientific manuscripts. And a very famous medieval monk by the name of the Venerable Bede came down to Spain because he wanted to translate the Quran into Latin so he could understand this new religion. He wanted to refute it, but he wanted to understand it. And he meets Robert of Kenan, persuades him to study the Quran and to translate it into Latin. He produces the first Latin translation, which meant the first translation of the Quran into a Western language that people could read. It's the language. Well, he produced not a very literal translation. And Arabic scholars have pilloried his translation, especially when Arabic got to be well known in the West, that is in the early modern period. Well, just a few years ago, a wonderful scholar by the name of Thomas Berman, who knew both the Arabic traditions about the Quran and knew Latin very well, studied his translation and put it over against the commentaries that Muslim scholars were writing about the Quran. And he discovered that Kenan had clearly read these and was interpreting the Quran the way the Muslims understood it. So I end with him, with Spain, because it seems to me it's a beautiful example of here how Christianity, who is now oppressed by the Muslims, makes a heroic effort to try to understand this other religion. So it's a beautiful example of Christian scholarship. And then finally, I turn to the last chapter, which is on the conversion of the Slobs. And let me just read a little bit of that last paragraph, and then I'll just read a little bit of the introduction. My wife told me, don't make it too long. So, where she is. She was going to give me a sign if I was going on too long. But here's the last paragraph. The conversion of the Slobs in the Balkans, and among the Rus living along the rivers north of the Black Sea, inaugurated a new era in the history of Christianity. A vast new territory, larger than the Byzantine Empire itself, was now poised to build a Christian civilization different from that of the Latin West and the ancient Christian lands of the Middle East. Now, I sort of explained what I mean by that. So here's the afterward, a part of it. After 1,000 years, the scope of early Christian history comes into full view. Geography gives the clearest picture. Christianity began in Jerusalem and spread east to Syria and Mesopotamia and on to India and China. In the first decade, churches were established in Egypt, Asia Minor, and Greece, later in the Balkans and among the Rus. In the West, the new faith took root in North Africa, Italy, Spain, and later in Northern Europe, the British Isles, and Scandinavia, including Iceland. Far to the south, it was adopted in Nubia and Ethiopia. By any measure, the movement that began among a small company of Jews in Jerusalem had become a global religion. The breadth and diversity of peoples and places makes it hard to see things whole. Yet there is a pattern, and it is defined by geography, language, and culture. By the end of the first millennium, Christians lived, with some notable exceptions like Armenia and Ethiopia, in three large geographical and cultural areas: the Syriac and Arabic Middle East, the Greek and Slavic East, and the Latin West. As each region had a different past and gave birth to distinctive forms of Christian life, art, architecture, worship, piety, and law, so the Christians living in each of these three large regions would have different futures. Christianity began in the Roman Empire, but as one looks down the span of the Christian past, the horizon shifts to lands beyond the imperial frontiers. Already in the 2nd century, the gospel had been carried to Syriac-speaking Christians in Edessa and Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. And merchants sailing from the Roman Egypt had planted a Christian community on the west coast of India. In the 4th century, the Armenians embraced a new religion, and on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, the preaching of St. Nino, who was a woman, led to the conversion of the Iberian royal house. By the year 500, the empire had collapsed in the west, and new forms of Latin Christianity emerged among the Germanic peoples of northern Europe. The Syriac-speaking Christians of the Persian Empire constituted themselves as a distinct Christian community under their own patriarch, or Catholicos, and Syriac-speaking monks traveled the Silk Road to Central Asia and to points east. Toward the end of the first millennium, Slavic-speaking peoples embraced Christianity in its Greek dress. The adaptability of Christianity to diverse linguistic and cultural traditions is remarkable. Christianity brought something new and at the same time received something old. And I gave you one example of that. The global outreach of Christianity in the early centuries is a testimony to its cultural adaptability and diversity. Christianity practiced among the Armenians differed from the ways of the Greeks or Ethiopians. Of course, the Armenians, Greeks, and Ethiopians had much in common. They were governed by bishops. They fostered monastic life. They baptized in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They confessed the Creed of Nicaea. but the differences in language, customs, liturgical practices, architecture, and art gave birth to distinctive spiritual and cultural forms of life across the Christian world. When the Crusaders arrived in the East to free their fellow Christians from the yoke of Islam, they had great difficulty recognizing and understanding the way Eastern Christians lived and prayed. So then I kind of come to the conclusion. I basically summarized and some of the things that I've talked about here. In the 7th century, a great shadow came over the Christian world. When Edward Gibbon introduced the Prophet Muhammad and his decline and fall of the Roman Empire, he observed that the rise of Islam was one of the most memorable revolutions which have impressed a new and lasting character on the nations of the globe. Gibbon saw that Islam did not just inaugurate a religious revolution. Its unparalleled expansion changed the course of history by altering the map of the world and creating a new geography. Textbook accounts of Christianity present its history as a tale of continuous growth and expansion. By a selective choice of periods, events, and geographical regions, the conventional account, that is seen from the perspective of Europe and North America, gives the impression that Christianity is always moving forward. Seen in global perspective, that picture is illusory. If one injects into this sanguine narrative the spread of Islam, things take on a different coloring. Set against the success of Islam and its staying power, the career of Christianity is marked as much by decline and attrition as it is by growth and triumph. By the middle of the 8th century, 100 years after the Arab conquest of Jerusalem, at least 50% of the world's Christians found themselves under Muslim rule. The great centers of Christian life in the early centuries, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Carthage, Seleucia, Ctesiphon, that's over in Iraq, were forced to submit to the dominion of Islam. Many of the major figures in early Christian history, including Origen, Cyprian, Athanasius, Augustine, Cyril of Alexandria, and Isidore of Seville, lived in cities later conquered by the Muslims. The great story of Christian success in the early centuries must be tempered by a melancholy account of decline and, in some cases, extinction. It was not only the Christians living in the Middle East who suffered under their new rulers. Christianity disappeared in North Africa, and a large part of the Greek-speaking world came under Muslim rule. The Arabs were initially stopped before they could take cities of Asia Minor, and Constantinople was spared. But in 1071, the Byzantines suffered a crushing defeat at Manzikert in eastern Asia Minor at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. Their victory opened the way into Central Asia Minor and led to the eventual destruction of Greek-speaking Christianity in the peninsula. In recent years, there has been much moralizing about the Crusades, but it is forgotten that the Crusades ended in failure. For a brief period, Christian kingdoms were established in the Holy Land in Syria, but in little more than a century, the territories the Crusaders conquered were reclaimed for Islam. The Kurdish conquest of Asia Minor was of far greater significance than the Crusades. Consider some statistics. In the 11th century, the population of Asia Minor was almost wholly Christian, that's Turkey. But in the 16th century, Muslims made up 90% of the population. During those centuries, the church lost most of its property. Its ecclesiastical structures were dismantled, and its bishops were prohibited from caring for their dioceses. As Muslim institutions emerged, the Christian population fled, and those who remained gradually adopted the religion of their masters. Today, there are only tiny remnants of ancient Christian communities in Turkey. Eventually, Constantinople, Greece itself, and parts of the Balkans came under Muslim rule during the time of the Ottoman Turks. These developments fall outside the scope of this book, but they are a weighty reminder that after the end of the first millennium, the great period of Christian growth and expansion was over. Christians face different futures depending on where they live. Eastern Christianity in both the Syro-Arabic East and the Greek Slavic East suffered grievously. Only in the West was Christianity able to control its future. And from the perspective of the West, Christianity in the East seems part of a vanished past. But Christianity is an Eastern religion, and its homeland is in the Middle East. A far better vantage point is Jerusalem. It was located on the western edge of a vast Aramaic-speaking area to the east, and it was at the eastern edge of an empire that reached to the British Isles in the west. The prophet Isaiah said that all the nations shall flow to the mountain of the house of the Lord. Jerusalem welcomed people from both east and west, and if one keeps the holy city in mind, the global history of Christianity will not be forgotten. Thank you very much.
Professor Wilken has generously offered to take questions, entertain comments, and we can pass around a microphone just so we can all hear one another. So where should we start? Here?
Yeah, I could probably speak loud enough.
Is monasticism a tradition, a Christian tradition?
Is
Monasticism a Christian tradition, and how has its definition changed over time?
It's definitely a Christian tradition. Not something that fitted all into the kind of urban society that is characteristic of the Greco-Roman world. There were things that had some similarity to it in terms of the philosophical schools, but nothing that made such a deep impression. And it really springs out of Christian sources. The words of Jesus was not married, he speaks about being eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God, and Paul, that is married and to burn. And already in the second century, outside observers had noticed that Christians were living a chaste life, some Christians. And they found it very strange, very puzzling. And they admired them, but it didn't make any sense of it. It's also not Jewish. Jews do not have anything close to monasticism. So there's no doubt about it. Now, clearly, there's monasticism in the East. Buddhism would be the best example. Of course, we have Tibetan Buddhism studied here at this university, and you see Tibetan Buddhist monks here. So it isn't in that sense, but in terms of the culture out of which Christianity came, it really cut against the grain of the Greco-Roman culture. Now, in terms of adaptability, it begins basically as a movement of individuals who want to search, to seek the face of God with as much intensity as possible, and this requires solitude, to cut oneself off from the world. But early on, it developed communal forms of monasticism, and then as the centuries went by, it adapted to the new circumstances. Whether that be becoming missionaries, or whether it becomes centers of cultural life within a basically non-urban society, especially in Western Europe. Then later on, in the Middle East, they become translators. And then, of course, in the 12th century, monasticism takes a whole new leap and moves out of the monastery, and we call them Mendicants, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. So it's one of the most adaptable institutions, but there are certain things about it that were unchangeable. And now that may be changed. There are people who consider it's basically been for celibate men and women. And that has persisted up to the present time. But there are some people who are trying to experiment with forms of communal life for married people who find themselves together. And I think among evangelicals this is beginning to happen. What I've heard.
Thank you.
Somebody over here. Question? Yeah.
Professor Wilken, thank you so much. It's a treat to sit at your feet again. Thank you. I was curious. I'm quite compelled by the choices you made regarding the specific personalities and personages that you did include. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, would you be willing to mention just a few of those, perhaps those over whom you wrestled the most to leave out?
The great Bishop Athanasius would be someone who's very important. and could have made a chapter on him, but it would be primarily a theological chapter, and as I said, I would try not to write a theological work. Some of the other great thinkers of his time. As far as the West is concerned, I try to be fairly broad there. I have a chapter on the spread of Christianity in the West, and so I deal with Patrick, but I don't deal with some of the other Celtic monks. I deal with Boniface, the Germans. Could have done more with some of the big ones up to Scandinavia. But again, I was trying to cut it down. Let's see, who else would be sort of conspicuously absent there? I have a chapter where the Ambrose figure is very large, so because I wanted to deal with the church-state kind of issue. Well, I don't have anything about Polycarp. He's a very big guy. In fact, Thomas Lowe wrote me, you should have more on the apologists, Justin Moore and people of that sort. So I do that by the chapter on Origen. I have a full chapter on Augustine, of course.
That's primarily what I was wondering.
Yeah, no, and the full chapter on Augustine, and that yes, and try to tell the story there. So I don't, for example, I don't really go into the great Pelagian controversy, which is, I have a few paragraphs on it. But no, I do have a chapter on Augustine, that had a must, and you have so much. Actually, that's one of the better chapters. I'm very, very satisfied with. I got a nice way to end it, with his death. Well, no, it really is. It's really you can tell a really nice story there, because he, the pastor that means a lot to me, actually. I'm not young. When he stepped down as bishop, and then the new bishop was going to be appointed, he said, and then he preached a sermon. He said, "In this life we are all bound to die, and for everyone his last day is always uncertain. Yet as babies we can look forward to being boys, and as boys to youth, as youths to being grown up, and as young men to reaching our prime, and our prime to growing old. Whether this will happen is uncertain, but there is always something to look forward to. But an old man has no further stage of life before him. Because God wished that I came to this town in my prime. I was a young man then, now I have grown old." Can't leave out that kind of stuff. Beautiful.
We have a question here.
You mentioned about the importance of bishops, and in the time period following the 1,000 years that you cover, bishops, particularly in the Western Church, become very instrumental in the building of massive cathedrals.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to how possibly toward the end of the era that you've written about, what was going on that eventually led to that direction?
Well, that's, Christianity becomes the religion of the society. It has the wealth and the resources to build, and so it seizes the opportunities it had all the way from the beginning. The first material culture, that is something that you could touch, was the building of a catacomb, and the reason they were able to do that is that because they had enough resources in the community to do so. In fact, Peter Brown's most recent magnificent book makes a big point of the importance of wealth. And I think that's an important factor throughout the Middle Ages. And of course, when you visit Europe, Caroline just recently went to Normandy. We went to see the battlefield and the cemetery. You stand in just sheer astonishment at the building of these great cathedrals. It's just beyond anything we can imagine. When you think of the kind of churches that we build today, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. So a lot of it has to do with establishment. Christianity is now the religion of the society and has the resources. And of course, the bishop becomes a key player in that. And you also have the artists, the architects and the masons and all the people who do all the things.
Question over here.
You mentioned the way a lot of contemporary Christians will bash the Constantinian settlement for the corruptions that are brought into the church. What are some of the positive impact that Constantinian conversion had for Christian culture?
Well, it made it possible for it to endure. It's that simple. I mean, if Constantine had not been converted, or someone else had followed him, Christianity would not have been able to exist for much longer. I mean, it needed, because once, and that's one of the things that the argument has to take into consideration. If Christianity is successful, it's going to make an impact on politics as well as makes an impact on everything else. And so, it's just part of what it means for the church to be successful and for it to set down roots in the community. But it has all sorts of problems. And again, I got a little quotation here, which I quote toward the end, and I think really illustrates the point well. You see, the thing that has to be remembered, in contrast to Islam, Christianity had 300 years without an alliance with political power. And Christians have never forgot that. That's very important. Very important. And so, in some ways, it's not natural. Jesus was not a political figure. But it's inevitable as Christianity grows. And I just have a couple of sentences on this toward the end. Even when the church and society were one and the king was considered the head of the Christian people, the church retained this distinctive identity. In part, that was because the bishop received his office from other bishops. That was what the great controversy was in the 11th century, in the 12th century. That's the true controversy. Not from the king or the prince, or not from the people. It's one of the strong points of it. But during the reign of Charlemagne, a king who actively directed the affairs of the church, Abbot Wala of the great monastery of Corbie in France, insisted that the church constituted a parallel sovereignty. The king, he said, should have public properties for the maintenance of his army, and the church should have church properties almost like a second public domain. That says it all. If it doesn't have that, and that's what the great struggle was in the 19th century of the Catholic Church, to free itself from the control of the kings and rulers of Western Europe. I mean, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, you still had the right of the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to veto a choice who was elected by the bishops, by the cardinals. So, I think that that's deeper than Christianity. I just think it's a misplaced argument. What they're really arguing about is the present. They're not arguing about the past. Constantine's one. He's a saint. Come on to the Eastern Christians. He's one of the good guys.
Another question here.
And the other thing about Constantine is people all talk about what was the Roman religion like. That's beside the point. He was an emperor. An emperor's got to make decisions on completely other ground. It doesn't matter whether he was pious or not. But he decided to do things, and a lot of beautiful things came from it. A lot of bad things came from it. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. In your research, did you get a sense where in the West Christianity began to be evangelism turned into Latinization rather than Christianization at a certain point, or is that more of a modern?
Oh, that's true. That's true. The strategy of the monks and bishops in the West was to teach people Latin and to transmit the faith in Latin. So you could not celebrate the Eucharist in the vernacular language. You could not baptize in the vernacular language. And so it created a Latin culture. And then the Romance languages developed independently of that, but it carried the tradition for centuries. Whereas in the East, they immediately went into the local language. And if necessary, for example, in Armenia, they had no alphabet because they didn't have a written language, and so they created an alphabet. And the same thing happened among the Slobs. And so it's a completely different strategy. And it was not until, of course, the 20th century that the Western Church, that is, the Roman Catholic part of the Western Church, went to the vernacular. It's just a completely different strategy, but you want to call it Latinization, but of course they created a whole Latin culture, a literary culture, and that language was used up until a couple hundred years ago. We think of it as a bookish language, but it was a spoken language. People could speak it and write it. So it's a different strategy. But Christianity is not like Judaism, or it's not like Islam, because they have no sacred language. And translation has always been part of Christianity from the very beginning.
Well, as a classicist myself, I think the victory of Latin has replaced it. So I'd like to invite you once again to thank our speaker, Professor